For years, Lumina village has lived under the oppressive rule of the elders, who demand obedience and blood sacrifices in the name of a cursed blood moon. Kato, a solitary healer, has always kept his head down, until the day he's forced to confront the dark secrets that have poisoned his home for generations. When Kato discovers that the upcoming blood moon ceremony is nothing more than a sinister ritual to extend the elders' power, he knows he must act. But he's not alone. At his side is Nika, a mysterious lover with a hidden past, and Amina, a brave villager willing to risk everything to overthrow the elders. As forbidden love, ancient magic, and dangerous secrets collide, Kato and Nika must navigate betrayal, heartbreak, and the looming threat of sacrifice. With the villagers' freedom and their own lives on the line, they must uncover the true power of the blood moon before time runs out. Can love and courage break the chains of fear, or will the shadows of the past consume them all? Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The sun hung low over Lumina village, casting an orange glow over the clay-roofed huts and narrow dirt paths. Kato wiped the sweat from his brow as he finished applying a poultice to an elderly woman's swollen ankle. Her pained expression softened into relief as his herbal remedy worked its magic. Though grateful for his skills, the villagers rarely stayed longer than necessary in Kato's presence, whispering rumors as they hurried away. Kato sighed, watching her hobble out of his modest hut. He lived alone on the outskirts of the village, where the dense forest crept close, its dark canopy always threatening to reclaim the land. His secluded life kept him safe from the village gossip, but it also meant a constant cloud of suspicion hung over him. As an unmarried man with no family ties, the villagers believed there must be something unnatural about him. Today, however, the air was thick with more than just suspicion. Tension crackled in the atmosphere as the blood moon ceremony approached, a night when the village elders would perform rituals to cleanse Lumina village of its so-called impurities. For weeks now, the elders had stirred up fear, insisting that the village's recent misfortunes, poor harvests, failing livestock, were due to the presence of those who defied tradition. Kato kept his head down, praying no one would turn their gaze on him. He was out collecting herbs in the forest when he heard the angry shouts. His heart skipped a beat. He dropped his basket and sprinted towards the village square, his worn sandals kicking up dust as he ran. The closer he got, the louder the noise became, a mix of jeers, cries, and the unmistakable crack of a whip. When Kato arrived at the square, a scene of horror unfolded before him. Bwana, the village enforcer and loyal henchman of Elder Django, was mercilessly beating Hassan, a young villager who lay crumpled on the ground, his face bruised and bleeding. The crowd around them cheered, their eyes wild with fervor. "What crime has he committed?" Kato shouted, pushing through the throng. His heart pounded, a mix of fear and fury surging through his veins. Bwana paused, the whip dangling from his hand, his dark eyes narrowing as he spotted Kato. He was caught with another man, Bwana spat. "The elders declared it a perversion that brings misfortune to our village." Kato's breath caught in his throat. He knew all too well the dangers of being branded as impure. Hassan's fate could easily be his own if anyone discovered his secret meetings with Nika. But he couldn't stand by and watch this brutality. He needs medical attention. Kato stepped forward, trying to reach Hassan, but Bwana thrust a heavy hand against his chest, sending him stumbling back. "What are you so eager to help him for, healer?" Bwana sneered. His voice carried through the crowd, drawing murmurs and pointed looks. "Perhaps you share his sickness? Is that why you live alone, away from decent folk?" The crowd erupted into whispers, and Kato felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. The sharp sting of Bwana's words pierced deeper than any blade. Faces he had known for years turned away, unwilling to meet his eyes. In that moment, he knew the seeds of doubt had been planted. Swallowing his fear, Kato lifted his chin. "He is a human being, Bwana. He doesn't deserve to die for." The crack of the whip silenced him. You forget your place, healer, Bwana growled, leaning in close enough for Kato to smell the sourness of his breath. You would do well to mind your business, or you might find yourself sharing his fate. Kato's fists clenched at his sides, but he knew better than to push further. The village's bloodlust had been stoked by fear, and he was just a heartbeat away from becoming their next target. Reluctantly, he stepped back, watching helplessly as Bwana dragged Hassan away, leaving a trail of blood on the dusty ground. The villagers turned away one by one, their eyes avoiding Kato as if he were a curse. Later that night, the moon hung low in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the forest. Kato slipped through the shadows, his heart pounding with each step. He had taken the longest route to their secret spot by the river, doubling back twice to make sure he wasn't followed. Nika was already waiting for him, his tall, lean figure silhouetted against the moonlit water. The sight of him, even in the dim light, sent a surge of warmth through Kato's chest. But tonight, there was no time for tenderness. What happened? Nika asked as soon as Kato reached him. I heard the commotion in the village. Kato recounted the brutal scene he had witnessed, the sound of the whip still echoing in his mind. Nika's face darkened with every word, his jaw clenched tight. We can't keep hiding like this, Nika whispered, his voice raw with frustration. They're getting bolder. If they find out about us. They won't, Kato cut in, though his voice shook. I won't let them. Nika's eyes softened, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. We need to be careful, Kato, Nika said, reaching out to touch his cheek. I can't lose you. Kato leaned into the touch, feeling the weight of their secret pressing down on him like a stone. The blood moon ceremony was only days away, and the elders were hungry for scapegoats. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out for them. We'll find a way, Kato whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. For now, all they had was the darkness to hide in, and the moon to bear witness to their forbidden love. The sun's first light crept over the village as Kato made his way back to his hut. He moved cautiously, his mind still replaying the previous night's secret meeting with Nika. The fear in Nika's eyes haunted him, and the taste of their hurried goodbye lingered on his lips. As he approached the outskirts, Kato noticed a figure waiting by his door. His heart sank. He couldn't afford any more scrutiny after yesterday's confrontation in the square. But as the morning mist cleared, he recognized Amina, his childhood friend. Amina, what are you doing here so early? Kato asked, forcing a smile as he approached. Amina looked around nervously before speaking. I had to see you, she said in a hushed tone. Rumors are spreading about you, Kato. People are saying you defended that boy because you share his inclinations. Kato's stomach churned, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. People say a lot of things, Amina, he replied, ushering her inside his hut. The less time they spent talking outside, the better. Once they were safely behind closed doors, Amina's worried eyes met his. I'm only telling you this because I care, Kato. The elders are growing more suspicious with each day. The blood moon ceremony is coming, and they're desperate to find someone to blame for the village's misfortunes. Kato exhaled sharply, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Thank you, Amina. But I've done nothing wrong. I just couldn't stand by and watch Bwana beat that poor boy to death. You know it's not about what you did, Kato, she said, her voice softening. It's about who you are. They're looking for any excuse to turn on those they don't understand. He could see the concern in her eyes, but Kato couldn't risk sharing the full truth, not even with Amina. I'll be careful, he promised. You have my word. Amina nodded reluctantly, but as she turned to leave, Kato could see the fear etched on her face. Once she was gone, the quiet of his hut seemed to press in on him, stifling. The blood moon was only days away, and if the village's paranoia continued to grow, there was no telling what they would do. Later that day, Kato tried to focus on his work, tending to a long line of patients that had formed outside his hut. The villagers were desperate to find remedies for their ailments that had become more frequent as the ceremony approached. Whispers of curses and evil spirits filled the air, and Kato knew it was only a matter of time before someone accused him of being the cause. As he ground herbs into a fine paste, a familiar face appeared in his doorway. It was Bwana, flanked by 2 guards. The air seemed to thicken as Bwana's cold eyes swept over Kato's humble dwelling. "We need your healing hands, Kato," Bwana said, though his voice carried no warmth. "One of the elders has fallen ill." Kato's hands stilled. The elders rarely came to him for help, preferring their own secretive remedies. "What happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "None of your concern," Bwana replied curtly. "Just do your job." Kato gathered his supplies and followed Bwana through the winding paths to the elders' quarters. As they walked, the villagers watched him pass, their eyes filled with suspicion. He could almost hear their thoughts. What does a healer have to do with the elders? When they reached the elders' hall, Kato was led into a dimly lit room where Elder Sephu lay gasping for breath. The old man's skin was pallid, his eyes glazed over with pain. Kato quickly assessed the symptoms: a high fever, shallow breathing, and a strange, dark mark spreading across the elder's chest. "This isn't a natural illness," Kato murmured under his breath. But before he could examine the mark more closely, Bwana's hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Enough talking," Bwana hissed. "Heal him." Kato gritted his teeth and focused on preparing a remedy. He could feel the elder's eyes on him, watching every move he made. As he applied a soothing salve to the elder's chest, he noticed that the dark mark was unlike any illness he had seen before. It seemed to pulse, almost like it was alive. A shiver ran down Kato's spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. He had a suspicion it was linked to the elder's dark practices, but he knew better than to voice his concerns. For now, he needed to play the obedient healer if he wanted to leave this room alive. Later that evening, Kato returned to his hut, exhausted from the tension-filled day. His mind raced with questions. What had caused Elder Sephu's strange illness? And what role did the blood moon ceremony play in all of this? He couldn't shake the feeling that the village's recent troubles were tied to something far more sinister than just disobedient villagers. As darkness fell, Kato once again slipped into the forest to meet Nika. This time, the air between them was heavy with unspoken fears. "Something terrible is coming," Nika said as soon as Kato reached him. "I can feel it in the air." Kato nodded, recounting his encounter with Elder Sephu and the strange mark he had seen. "I think the elders are hiding something," he whispered. "Something that could explain why the village has been cursed." Nika's eyes widened. If the elders are using dark magic, then the blood moon ceremony isn't about purifying the village, it's about strengthening their own power. Kato's heart raced at the thought. "We need to find proof," he said, gripping Nika's hands. "If we can expose them, maybe we can stop the ceremony." "But how?" Nika asked, fear flickering in his eyes. "If they suspect us, we're dead." Kato looked into the darkness beyond the river. "We'll have to be careful. But I won't let them destroy us. Not without a fight." As they held each other under the shadow of the moon, Kato knew their time was running out. The blood moon was coming, and with it, a reckoning that could destroy them both. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds as Kato and Nika navigated the winding path that led deeper into the trees. The moonlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. They moved cautiously, the tension between them palpable. Every rustle in the underbrush made Kato's heart jump. Anyone could be hiding in the darkness, watching them. Kato had arranged this meeting in a more secluded part of the forest than usual, knowing they couldn't afford to be careless after everything that had happened. When they finally reached their hidden clearing by the riverbank, Kato pulled Nika into a tight embrace, holding him as if the world might snatch him away at any moment. "You're late," Nika whispered, his voice tinged with worry. "I thought something had happened to you." Kato sighed, resting his forehead against Nika's. "I was delayed," he said softly, the events of the day still weighing heavily on him. "One of the elders is sick. Bwana dragged me into their quarters to treat him." "But Nika..." He hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "What is it?" Nika asked, pulling back to search Kato's eyes. There was something strange about his illness. A dark mark on his chest that seemed alive. Kato's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think it has something to do with the blood moon ceremony." Nika's eyes widened in shock. You think the elders are using dark magic? He asked, his voice barely more than a breath. That could explain why the village is suffering. They're sacrificing us to maintain their power. Kato nodded grimly. I don't know for sure, but it's a strong suspicion. We have to find proof before the ceremony, or they'll continue to scapegoat innocent people. Nika's expression hardened. Then we need to act quickly. If we don't stop them, who knows who they'll choose as the next sacrifice. The burden of secrets. As they sat by the river, Kato leaned into Nika, drawing strength from his presence. But even in this moment of closeness, a sense of dread gnawed at him. He had been holding back a secret that threatened to break them apart, one he wasn't sure how to reveal. Nika, there's something I need to tell you, Kato began, his voice unsteady. Nika turned to him, his gaze steady and expectant. But before Kato could continue, they heard the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Instantly, they were on alert. Kato's heart pounded in his chest as he motioned for Nika to stay silent. They crouched low, hiding among the tall reeds by the riverbank. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied by the murmur of hushed voices. Kato strained his ears to make out the conversation, his pulse quickening when he recognized one of the voices. It was Bwana, speaking to another villager in a tone laced with urgency. They say the spirits are restless, Bwana was saying. If the elders don't find a scapegoat soon, it'll be our heads on the chopping block. What about that healer? The second voice asked. The one who interfered with your punishment yesterday. He's already under suspicion. Kato's blood ran cold. They were talking about him. Bwana's voice was a low growl. If it were up to me, we'd string him up tomorrow. But the elders want to wait until the ceremony. They think they can draw more power from his blood under the light of the blood moon. Nika's grip on Kato's arm tightened, his eyes wide with fear. Kato could barely breathe, each word from Bwana's lips confirming his worst fears. The elders were planning to use him as a sacrifice. The footsteps faded, leaving Kato and Nika in tense silence. It was only when the forest returned to its usual nocturnal hum that they dared to move. They're going to kill you, Nika whispered, his voice trembling. We have to leave. Tonight? Kato shook his head. No. If we run, they'll just find someone else to take my place. We have to find proof of their corruption. It's the only way to stop this madness. Nika's eyes were wet with tears, but he nodded. Then we'll do it together. But promise me, Kato, promise me you won't let them take you. Kato pulled Nika into a desperate embrace. I promise, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise he could keep. A shocking discovery. The next morning, Kato returned to the village with a plan. He would search for more evidence, something he could use to expose the elders. But as he made his way through the crowded marketplace, he spotted a familiar face among the throng, Amina. She looked distraught, her eyes red as if she had been crying. She waved him over urgently, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Kato, she whispered when he reached her. I overheard something last night. The elders. They're planning something terrible during the blood moon ceremony. Kato's heart skipped a beat. What did you hear? He asked, gripping her arm tighter than he intended. They're going to use a sacrifice to draw power from the spirits, Amina said, her voice quivering. And they've chosen you, Kato. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. The confirmation of his worst fears left him momentarily speechless. But before he could respond, Amina leaned in closer, her voice barely audible. There's more, she said. They're watching you. If you make one wrong move, they'll arrest you before the ceremony. Kato nodded, his mind racing. Thank you, Amina. But you must be careful. If they find out you told me. I don't care, she interrupted, tears streaming down her face. Just promise me you'll find a way out of this. I can't lose you too. Kato embraced her tightly, whispering his gratitude. But as he pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running out. He had to act fast, or the blood moon ceremony would be the end of him and Nika. The sun was just beginning to set as Kato slipped out of his hut, leaving the village behind. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage, a preparation for the blood moon ceremony that was now only 2 days away. Kato's heart raced as he hurried along the hidden path toward the forest. Tonight, he was determined to uncover the secrets the elders had been hiding. The memory of Amina's urgent warning replayed in his mind. The elders had chosen him as the sacrifice, and unless he found a way to expose them, he would not live to see the dawn after the blood moon. With Nika's support, Kato had resolved to search for the truth, even if it meant risking everything. As the shadows deepened, Kato reached the ancient cave hidden deep within the forest, a place long abandoned and spoken of only in whispers. The cave was rumored to hold sacred scrolls and relics from a time when Lumina Village was first established. If the elders were using dark magic, perhaps he could find proof here. Kato lit a small lantern and cautiously entered the cave, the cool, damp air brushing against his skin. The walls were lined with old carvings, depictions of rituals and long-forgotten ceremonies. As he ventured deeper, he noticed faint markings on the ground, a sign that someone had been here recently. His heart pounded at the realization that the elders were keeping secrets even in places the villagers believed to be cursed. A shocking revelation. After what felt like hours of searching, Kato's lantern flickered over a hidden alcove. Tucked away inside was an old chest covered in dust. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing ancient scrolls bound in worn leather. He unrolled one of the scrolls, his eyes scanning the faded writing. It was written in an ancient script, but Kato could still make out the key parts. His breath caught as he realized what it was: a prophecy. Only a love forged under the light of the blood moon can break the curse that binds the land. The blood of the innocent will cleanse, but the blood of the beloved will save. Kato's heart pounded in his chest. The prophecy seemed to confirm his worst suspicions. The elders weren't trying to protect the village, they were using the ceremony to tighten their grip on power. The sacrifices were not to appease the spirits, but to draw dark energy that would prolong their own lives and control over Lumina Village. But there was more, something that sent a chill through Kato's veins. The prophecy spoke of a beloved who could break the curse with a sacrificial act of love. Could it mean that only the blood of someone who loved deeply, like him or Nika, could end the dark magic that had plagued the village? The dilemma. Kato's mind raced. If this prophecy was true, it explained why the elders had targeted him. They knew about his relationship with Nika. The love they shared, forged in secret, might be the very thing that could break the curse, and it was why the elders wanted to silence him before the blood moon ceremony. But now, the stakes were even higher. If they were discovered, it wouldn't just be his life at risk. The prophecy hinted that the curse could only be lifted by a willing sacrifice. Would he or Nika have to die to save the village? Kato hurriedly rolled up the scrolls and tucked them into his satchel. He needed to show Nika. If they were going to stop the elders and expose the truth, they would have to do it together. As he made his way back through the cave, he couldn't shake the weight of the revelation. The very love that had kept him alive through the darkest times might now be the key to saving everyone or destroying them both. A tense reunion. Kato emerged from the cave and sprinted back through the forest, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. When he reached the riverbank, Nika was already there, pacing anxiously. "You're late," Nika said, his voice tinged with worry. "I thought they caught you." "No, but I found something," Kato replied, pulling out the scrolls. "The elders. They've been hiding the truth. The blood moon ceremony isn't what we thought. It's not about appeasing spirits, it's about extending their power." Nika's eyes widened as Kato explained the prophecy. "If this is true, then they're going to use you as the sacrifice to draw power," Nika whispered, his face paling. "Yes," Kato confirmed, his voice thick with dread. "But there's more. The prophecy says that only a willing sacrifice from someone who loves deeply can break the curse. They're not just after anyone, they're after us." A heavy silence hung between them as they both absorbed the weight of Kato's discovery. Nika's eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Then we have to stop them," he said fiercely. "We can't let them use you like that." Kato shook his head. "It's not just about me. If the prophecy is right, they'll come after you too, Nika. They know we're in love, and they'll use it against us. But if the prophecy is true, then maybe we can use it to stop them," Nika said, gripping Kato's hands. What if we found a way to break the curse without one of us having to die? Kato wanted to believe him, but the fear in his heart was too strong. We'll need proof, he said, looking at the scrolls. We need to expose the elders before the blood moon ceremony. If we can turn the villagers against them, we might stand a chance. Nika nodded, determination hardening his features. Then let's find that proof. Together. A dangerous decision. Kato and Nika devised a plan to infiltrate the elders' chambers to find more evidence. They knew it was a risk, but with the ceremony only 2 days away, time was running out. As they parted that night, Kato couldn't shake the feeling that they were on borrowed time. He watched as Nika disappeared into the shadows, praying that they would both survive the coming storm. The blood moon loomed on the horizon, and with it, a reckoning that would change everything. The night air was thick with tension as Kato made his way through the village under the cloak of darkness. Every shadow seemed to shift with hidden threats, every sound carried the risk of discovery. The blood moon was only a day away, and time was running out for him and Nika to find the evidence they needed to expose the elders' corruption. Kato slipped into the narrow alleyways, careful to avoid the patrols. His destination was the heart of Lumina Village, the Elders' Hall, a fortified stone building that loomed like a dark sentinel over the rest of the village. Tonight, he and Nika would attempt their most dangerous mission yet, breaking into the elders' chambers to find proof of their dark rituals. When he reached the agreed meeting point near the marketplace, Nika was already waiting, his eyes scanning the shadows. He relaxed only when he saw Kato approaching. "Are you ready for this?" Kato whispered, his voice barely audible over the faint rustle of leaves. Nika nodded, a grim determination in his eyes. "If we're caught, there's no turning back," he replied. "But we need to end this before they can use the blood moon's power." Kato's heart clenched at the thought of what could happen if they failed. The prophecy they'd discovered weighed heavily on his mind, especially the part that suggested one of them might have to make the ultimate sacrifice. But for now, he pushed those fears aside. They had to act. Breaking in. They moved silently through the village, keeping to the shadows. The Elders' Hall was heavily guarded, but Kato and Nika had spent the past day observing the patrols, noting the shifts and weak spots in their defenses. When they reached the rear entrance, Nika drew a small vial from his satchel, a sleeping potion Kato had prepared earlier. With careful precision, Nika tossed the vial at a pair of guards, who quickly collapsed into unconsciousness. "Let's move," Nika urged, and they slipped through the door before anyone could notice. Inside, the hall was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something far more sinister, a faint metallic tang that sent a chill down Kato's spine. They crept down the corridor, searching for the elders' secret chambers where the dark rituals were said to take place. As they turned a corner, they heard muffled voices. Kato gestured for Nika to follow him, and they pressed themselves against the wall, straining to listen. "We cannot delay the ceremony," came the deep, gravelly voice of Elder Django. "The villagers are restless, and if they see any weakness, they'll turn on us." A second voice, softer but no less commanding, responded. "Do not worry. Once the blood moon rises, we will have the power to bind the spirits for another generation. But we need the healer's blood to seal the ritual." Kato's heart nearly stopped. They were talking about him. The elders truly planned to use him as a sacrifice. He glanced at Nika, who looked pale but resolute. They had to find concrete evidence of these plans, something they could use to rally the villagers against the elders. The hidden chamber. They waited until the voices faded before continuing down the corridor. Finally, they found a heavy wooden door marked with strange runes. Kato's pulse quickened. This had to be where the elders were hiding their secrets. Nika tried the handle, but it was locked. With a frown, he pulled out a small set of tools from his satchel and began picking the lock. Kato kept watch, praying that no one would discover them. After what felt like an eternity, there was a faint click, and the door swung open. Inside, the chamber was filled with ancient scrolls, strange relics, and a large, ornately carved altar stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay. Kato's stomach churned as he approached the altar, trying not to think about the countless lives that had been sacrificed on it. "What is this?" Nika whispered, his eyes wide with horror. Cato rifled through the scrolls on a nearby table, desperately searching for anything that could confirm their suspicions. His hands trembled as he unrolled a scroll written in the same ancient script as the prophecy they had found earlier. "It's a ritual," Cato said, his voice barely a whisper. "The elders are planning to use the blood moon to bind the spirits and extend their power. But it requires the blood of someone pure of heart, a willing sacrifice." Nika's face went pale. "That's why they chose you," he said, his voice shaking. "You're the healer. They think your sacrifice will make the ritual even more powerful." Cato's mind raced. He had to get this information to the villagers, but how could he convince them to turn against the elders, who had ruled over them for generations? A sudden betrayal. Before they could formulate a plan, the door to the chamber burst open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Amina. Her eyes were wide with panic as she took in the scene. "Cato, Nika, you have to leave." "The guards are coming," she said breathlessly. Cato's heart lifted with hope until he saw the flicker of guilt in her eyes. Behind her, Bwana and several guards appeared, their weapons drawn. "What have you done, Amina?" Nika demanded, betrayal thick in his voice. "I had no choice," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They threatened my family. I couldn't let them hurt the people I love." Bwana stepped forward, a cruel smile on his lips. "You thought you could defy the elders and get away with it?" he sneered. "Now, you'll pay the price." Cato's mind raced. They were trapped. But then he remembered the scroll he had tucked into his satchel. If they could get it to the villagers, there was still a chance to expose the elders' plans. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Cato grabbed Nika's hand and shoved past Amina, using the element of surprise to break through the guards. They sprinted down the corridor, the sound of pursuit echoing behind them. A desperate escape. Cato and Nika burst out of the elders' hall and fled into the night. The village was eerily quiet, the only sound their ragged breaths and the distant shouts of the guards. They needed to reach the safety of the forest before they were caught. As they ran, Nika looked back at Cato, his eyes filled with both fear and fierce determination. "We can't let them win," he said. "If they get their hands on that scroll, it's over." Cato nodded, his resolve hardening. "We'll expose them," he promised. No matter the cost. They disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the scroll clutched tightly in Cato's hand. But with the blood moon ceremony only a day away, they knew they were running out of time. The fate of Lumina Village, and their own lives, hung in the balance. The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy of the forest as Cato and Nika raced deeper into the shadows, the sound of pursuing guards fading behind them. The stolen scroll clutched in Cato's hand felt like a lifeline, proof of the elders' dark rituals. But with Bwana's guards scouring the village and Amina's betrayal fresh in their minds, they knew they couldn't rest. Cato's breath came in harsh gasps as they finally slowed near an old, overgrown shrine hidden deep within the forest. The spot had once been a place of worship for the forest spirits, long abandoned when the elders took control of Lumina Village's beliefs. They were safe for now, but Cato couldn't shake the image of Amina's tear-streaked face from his mind. Nika leaned against a tree, trying to catch his breath. "I can't believe she betrayed us," he muttered, his voice laced with anger and hurt. Cato looked down at the scroll in his hands, the crumpled parchment a testament to the dangerous knowledge they now held. "We don't know her reasons," he said softly, though his heart ached with betrayal. "She might have been trying to protect someone." Nika turned to face Cato, his eyes blazing. "And because of that, she put our lives at risk." "She put you at risk, Cato." His fists clenched, his frustration and fear spilling over. Cato reached out, placing a calming hand on Nika's arm. "We don't have time for this," he said quietly. "We have to focus on what's next. The blood moon ceremony is tomorrow night. If we don't act now, they'll go through with their ritual." Nika exhaled sharply, forcing himself to calm down. "You're right," he said, his voice steadying. "What's the plan?" "The plan takes shape." Cato unrolled the scroll, holding it up to the pale moonlight. The ancient symbols and incantations were written in a language few in the village could understand, but Kato's training as a healer had given him enough knowledge to decipher the key parts. The elders are planning to use my blood to bind the spirits and extend their power, Kato explained. But if we expose this to the villagers before the ceremony, we might be able to stop them. Nika's brow furrowed. But the villagers are terrified of the elders. They've been brainwashed to believe that anyone who defies them will bring ruin upon the village. Kato nodded. That's why we need to show them proof. We have to find a way to reveal the scroll and convince the villagers that the elders are the real reason for the curses. Nika's eyes softened as he looked at Kato. I'm with you, he said. But we need someone on the inside, someone the villagers trust. Kato's mind immediately went to Amina. Despite her betrayal, she was well-liked and respected in the village. If they could persuade her to help, she might be able to turn the tide in their favor. But after what had happened, could they trust her again? A risky return. As dawn broke over Lumina Village, Kato and Nika made their way back, keeping to the outskirts to avoid detection. They needed to find Amina and convince her to join their cause. But Kato couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt in his chest. What if Amina had truly chosen her side? The marketplace was already bustling by the time they arrived. Villagers rushed about, preparing for the blood moon ceremony, their faces a mix of anxiety and excitement. Kato scanned the crowd, searching for Amina, while Nika kept a watchful eye on the patrols. Finally, they spotted her near the well, her face pale and drawn. Kato took a deep breath and approached her, Nika close behind. Amina, Kato called softly. She turned, her eyes widening in shock and something that looked like relief. Kato. Nika, she whispered, glancing around nervously. You shouldn't be here. If Bwana sees you. We know you tipped him off last night, Nika interrupted, his voice sharp. Why, Amina? After everything, why would you betray us? Tears welled in her eyes. You don't understand, she pleaded. The elders threatened my family. They said they'd burn our home and take my sister if I didn't cooperate. I didn't want to betray you, I had no choice. Kato's anger softened as he saw the desperation in her eyes. He knew all too well the lengths to which the elders would go to maintain control. Listen, Amina, he said, stepping closer. We've found proof, evidence that the elders are using dark magic to keep the village under their control. If we expose it, we can free everyone. Amina hesitated, torn between fear and the desire to do what was right. Even if you have proof, the villagers won't believe you, she said. The elders have poisoned their minds. That's why we need your help, Nika said, his voice gentler now. You're the only one they'll listen to. A desperate alliance. Amina looked between Kato and Nika, her expression conflicted. If I help you and we fail, they'll kill us all, she whispered, her voice trembling. Kato reached into his satchel and pulled out the scroll. We can't do this without you, he said. You're the only one who can convince the villagers to listen. For a long moment, Amina stared at the scroll, her face a mask of fear and determination. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said. I'll help you. But we have to act quickly. The elders are already making preparations for the ritual. Once the blood moon rises, it will be too late. Nika let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Thank you, Amina, he said. We need to gather the villagers in the square tonight, before the ceremony begins. Amina wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. I'll do what I can to gather them, she promised. But if Bwana or the elders catch wind of this, we'll handle Bwana, Kato said firmly. You focus on getting the villagers to listen. We'll meet you in the square at dusk. The turning point. As Kato and Nika left Amina to prepare, they exchanged a look of grim determination. They had taken the first step in their plan, but it was a long shot. Convincing the villagers to rise against the elders would not be easy, especially when the threat of punishment loomed over them. Kato took Nika's hand, squeezing it tightly. No matter what happens tonight, we do this together, he said. Nika nodded, his eyes filled with fierce resolve. Together, he agreed. With the blood moon ceremony only hours away, They knew this was their last chance to stop the elders and save Lumina Village from their dark rituals. As they disappeared into the shadows once more, the weight of what was to come pressed heavily on their shoulders. The sun was slipping beneath the horizon as Kato and Nika crept through the dense forest that bordered Lumina Village. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, wafting from the ceremonial fires the villagers were lighting in preparation for the blood moon. The night was almost upon them, and they were running out of time. With Amina's reluctant agreement to help them rally the villagers, Kato and Nika knew they had only one chance to secure undeniable proof of the Elder's dark magic. They had to return to the hidden chamber beneath the Elder's Hall to retrieve the ancient scrolls and relics that documented the blood rituals. Without it, the villagers would never believe the truth. As they approached the edge of the village, Nika grabbed Kato's arm. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, his eyes darting around for any sign of movement. "If we get caught again." Kato nodded, his resolve unwavering. "We need something tangible to show the villagers. Amina's words alone won't be enough. We expose their secrets or we die trying." With that, they slipped into the shadows, making their way back toward the Elder's Hall. This time, they knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. A treacherous descent. Under the cover of darkness, they reached the rear entrance of the Elder's Hall, where they had broken in before. The air was tense, every rustle and whisper sending their nerves on edge. Nika quickly worked the lock with his tools, his hands moving with practiced speed. The door clicked open, and they slipped inside. The hallways were eerily silent, lit only by the flickering glow of ceremonial torches. Kato could feel the weight of the ritual preparations. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moon to rise. "This way," Kato whispered, leading Nika down a narrow staircase that descended into the depths of the building. The air grew cooler and damp as they descended, the scent of mold and decay becoming stronger. This was the part of the hall few had ever seen, the hidden underbelly where the elders performed their most secretive rituals. When they reached the bottom, they came face to face with the heavy iron door that led to the hidden chamber. It was guarded this time. 2 sentries stood alert, their faces shadowed by the torchlight. "Leave this to me," Nika murmured. He pulled out another vial of sleeping potion Kato had prepared, silently throwing it at the guard's feet. The liquid vaporized on contact, filling the air with a faint, sickly sweet scent. The guard slumped to the ground, unconscious. "Let's go," Nika urged, and Kato quickly unlatched the door. The Elder's secrets revealed. The hidden chamber was just as they had left it, filled with dark relics, ancient scrolls, and the blood-stained altar. But there was something new. A massive tome lay open on the altar, the pages covered in arcane symbols and diagrams. Kato's eyes widened. This was it, the proof they needed. Kato rushed to the altar, frantically flipping through the pages. This details the entire ritual," he whispered. "They've been sacrificing villagers for generations to bind the spirits and extend their own power." Nika stood watch by the door, his eyes darting nervously back and forth. "We need to grab what we can and get out before they realize we're here." As Kato stuffed the scrolls and the tome into his satchel, something else caught his eye, a small, ornate box tucked away beneath the altar. He opened it, revealing a set of gleaming ritual knives and vials filled with a dark, viscous liquid. The markings on the knives matched the runes he had seen on Elder Sephiu during his illness. "This must be how they've been cursing the villagers," Kato realized, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're using this dark magic to make people sick and then blaming it on impurities to control the village." Before they could take another step, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Kato's heart lurched. "Someone's coming," he hissed. "We need to hide." Caught in the shadows. Nika grabbed Kato's hand, pulling him into a dark alcove just as the door swung open. The flickering torchlight revealed Bwana and Elder Django stepping into the chamber. Kato's breath caught in his throat. The two of them pressed tightly against the wall, praying they wouldn't be discovered. "This had better work," Bwana growled. "The villagers are growing restless. If they suspect we've been lying to them, we'll be the ones facing the torch and pitchfork." Elder Django's voice was calm, but there was an edge of desperation to it. Once the blood moon rises and we have the healer's blood, the ritual will bind the spirits again. The villagers will see that we've kept them safe. Nika's grip on Kato's arm tightened, his eyes wide with anger. Kato could feel his own rage simmering. These men were willing to sacrifice innocent lives to maintain their power, and if they didn't act now, Kato would be the next victim. As Bwana and Django turned to leave, Kato saw his chance. He and Nika sprang from their hiding spot, racing past the closing door. But Bwana was quicker than they anticipated. With a roar, he lunged, grabbing Nika by the arm. "Kato, run!" Nika shouted, struggling to break free. But Kato couldn't abandon Nika, not after everything they had been through. He grabbed one of the ritual knives from his satchel and slashed at Bwana's arm. The guard yelped in pain, releasing his grip. Together, Kato and Nika fled up the staircase, their lungs burning as they sprinted through the hallways. The alarm bells began to ring, echoing through the stone corridors. They burst out of the rear door into the night, the sound of pursuing guards growing louder. A narrow escape. Kato and Nika ran through the village, their breath coming in desperate gasps. They could hear the shouts of the guards behind them, but they couldn't stop now. Their only hope was to reach the old shrine in the forest where Amina was waiting to rally the villagers. As they approached the edge of the village, Kato glanced back and saw the flicker of torches gaining on them. "We won't make it," he gasped. Nika's eyes flashed with a sudden determination. "Go! I'll hold them off." "No!" Kato shouted, grabbing Nika's arm. "We do this together." They pressed on, crashing through the underbrush until they reached the shrine, where Amina stood surrounded by a handful of villagers. Her face was pale but determined. "You got it?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the satchel. Kato nodded, pulling out the stolen scrolls. "We have the proof. Now we just need to show it to everyone before the ceremony starts." Amina turned to the villagers. "Listen to them," she pleaded. "The elders have been lying to us. They're using the ceremony to steal our lives." The villagers murmured among themselves, fear and doubt in their eyes. But as Kato unfurled the scrolls, showing them the dark rituals described in detail, a ripple of shock went through the crowd. Just as the villagers began to turn, the guards burst through the trees, led by Bwana. "Arrest them," he roared. But this time, the villagers didn't back down. Spurred on by the evidence Kato had shown them, they began to push back, forming a barrier between the guards and Kato. The night air was filled with the murmur of confused voices and the crackle of torchlight. The villagers gathered in a tight circle around Kato, Nika, and Amina. The scrolls and relics they had exposed were spread out before them on the ground, illuminated by the flickering firelight. Faces once filled with blind trust in the elders were now painted with doubt and fear. Kato's heart pounded as he scanned the crowd. They had managed to convince some villagers of the elders' treachery, but others still hesitated, unwilling to believe that their leaders had deceived them for so long. "Look at these scrolls," Kato shouted, raising his voice above the noise. "The blood moon ceremony isn't a ritual to protect the village, it's a way for the elders to steal our lives and extend their power." The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between disbelief and a growing sense of betrayal. Amina stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "You all know me," she pleaded. "I've seen the rituals with my own eyes. Kato and Nika speak the truth. We can't let the elders continue to control us with lies and bloodshed." But just as it seemed the tide was turning, the villagers gasped in unison. The crowd parted as Elder Django strode forward, flanked by Bwana and a dozen armed guards. The air seemed to grow colder as he approached, his stern gaze sweeping over the gathering. "Enough," Django's voice boomed, silencing the whispers. "You've all been deceived by these rebels," he said, pointing a gnarled finger at Kato and Nika. "They seek to divide us on the eve of the blood moon, to weaken our village in its time of need." The villagers looked back and forth between Kato and Django, confusion etched on their faces. The moment hung in the air, fragile as glass. The dark revelation. Before Kato could respond, Django's gaze locked onto Nika. His eyes narrowed, and a twisted smile curled his lips. Nika, you fool, Django hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. You think your love for this healer can protect you? Did he ever tell you the truth about your past? Nika froze, confusion flashing across his face. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice shaking. Django stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. You never wondered why you were abandoned, why no family claimed you. It's because you were a shameful secret, a son born from an affair I had to hide to protect my position. You are my blood, Nika. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Nika's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock. No, that's not true, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You're lying. But the look on Django's face told him it was no lie. Kato's heart broke as he watched Nika stagger back, struggling to process the revelation. Yes, it's true, Django continued, his voice turning cold and cruel. I kept you hidden because you were a stain on my honor. And now you've become a tool for these heretics. He turned to the villagers, his voice rising. This is how far they will go to use my own son against me, to sow discord and chaos among us. The weight of betrayal. Nika's knees buckled, and Kato rushed to his side, wrapping a protective arm around him. Nika, listen to me, Kato whispered urgently. This changes nothing between us. He's only trying to break you. But Nika's eyes were hollow, his entire world collapsing around him. All my life, I wondered who my family was, he muttered, tears streaming down his cheeks. And now I find out it's him, a monster willing to sacrifice innocent lives. Django's voice cut through the air like a blade. It's too late, Nika. You've chosen your side, and now you'll face the consequences. Guards, seize them. The armed guards surged forward, weapons drawn. Kato's heart pounded as he pulled Nika to his feet. We have to move, now, he shouted. But before they could flee, Bwana stepped in front of them, blocking their path. His eyes gleamed with a twisted sense of loyalty to Django. You're not going anywhere, he growled. Amina, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly sprang into action. She grabbed a torch from a nearby villager and swung it wildly at the guards. Run, Kato, she screamed. Take Nika and run. Kato didn't hesitate. Grabbing Nika's hand, he pushed through the panicking crowd. Behind them, the air filled with shouts and the clang of steel. The villagers, finally realizing the extent of the elders' lies, began to turn on their leaders. The square erupted into chaos as villagers clashed with the guards. A desperate escape. Kato and Nika dashed through the maze-like streets of the village, the sounds of the uprising growing fainter behind them. Nika was stumbling, still reeling from Django's revelation, but Kato kept a firm grip on his hand, pulling him onward. We need to reach the old shrine, Kato urged, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Amina will meet us there with the villagers who are on our side. Nika's voice was raw with anguish. I don't understand. Why did he tell me now? Why use me like this? Kato stopped briefly, turning to face Nika. He cupped Nika's face in his hands, forcing him to focus. Because he knows it will break you, Kato said urgently. He wants to destroy your spirit so you won't fight back. But we can't let him win, Nika. Not now. Nika took a shuddering breath, his eyes hardening with resolve. You're right, he whispered. We have to stop him. They continued their flight through the darkened streets, finally reaching the outskirts of the village where the forest began. As they entered the dense thicket, the sound of drums and chants from the village square echoed in the distance. The blood moon ceremony was beginning, and with it, the elders' final attempt to cement their control. The final gathering. When they reached the shrine, Amina was already there, surrounded by a small group of villagers who had managed to break away from the elders' influence. Their faces were grim but determined. You made it, Amina said, relief flooding her features. We don't have much time. The ceremony is starting, and the elders are planning to go through with the sacrifice. Kato held up the scroll they had taken from the hidden chamber. We have to stop them before it's too late, he said. This scroll proves that the ritual is a lie, that they're using it to draw power for themselves. Amina nodded. The villagers are starting to turn against the elders, but we need one final push. If we can expose this during the ceremony, we might be able to end their reign for good. Nika, still shaken but resolute, stepped forward. "We'll fight," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to do it together. For all the lives they've taken, for everyone they've hurt." Cato squeezed Nika's hand, a silent promise passing between them. This was it, their last chance to free the village from the elders' grip. As the blood-red moon began to rise above the treetops, they knew there was no turning back. The moon was a vivid crimson disk in the sky as the blood moon ceremony began. The villagers gathered in the square, eyes reflecting the eerie red light that bathed everything in an otherworldly glow. The drums pounded in a steady rhythm, sending vibrations through the ground as Elder Django stepped forward to address the crowd. Cato, Nika, and Amina crouched behind the stone wall at the edge of the square, their hearts pounding in sync with the drums. This was their moment. The villagers were on edge, torn between loyalty to the elders and the growing doubt sown by the whispers of rebellion. "They're starting," Nika whispered, his eyes fixed on the spectacle unfolding before them. "We have to move fast." Amina nodded, her face set with grim determination. "Once Django begins the ritual, it'll be harder to stop them. We need to break their hold now, while the villagers are still unsure." Cato took a deep breath, clutching the scroll they had retrieved from the hidden chamber. It was their last hope to expose the elders' deception. "Let's go," he whispered. "It's now or never." The confrontation begins. As they stepped into the square, the villagers turned to look at them with a mix of surprise and confusion. The drums faltered for a moment, then resumed, faster and more urgent. Cato's voice cut through the night like a knife. "People of Lumina Village," he shouted, holding the scroll high above his head. "You've been lied to. The elders have been using this ritual to drain your lifeblood, to extend their own power." Gasps rippled through the crowd as they turned toward Elder Django, who stood on the raised platform with the other elders. His face twisted into a mask of fury as he gestured to the guards. "Seize them," Django bellowed, his voice amplified by the drums. "They're trying to disrupt the ceremony and doom us all." But this time, the villagers didn't move. They hesitated, their eyes shifting between Cato, who stood with scroll in hand, and the elders who had ruled over them for so long. Whispers of uncertainty spread like wildfire through the crowd. Nika took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "These are the words of the elders," he shouted, pointing to the scroll. "They've been sacrificing us, cursing us with dark magic to keep themselves in power. My own father, Elder Django, was willing to sacrifice me to protect his secrets." The villagers gasped, turning to Django for an explanation. But the elder's face only darkened further. "Lies." He spat, his eyes burning with hatred. "He's been corrupted by that heretic healer. Don't listen to them." Turning the tide. Amina took her chance, stepping into the middle of the square with a torch in hand. "Look at what Cato found," she cried, pointing to the scrolls laid out on the ground. "This is proof. The elders have been lying to us for generations. They're the reason we've suffered. Our sickness, our failing crops, our cursed lives, it's all because of them." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, villagers exchanging uncertain glances. Cato could see the flicker of doubt turning into something more, a spark of anger, of betrayal. But they needed one more push to ignite the rebellion. Cato stepped forward, his voice ringing out with a desperate urgency. "The blood moon doesn't demand our blood, it's the elders who demand it. Tonight, we can end their tyranny. But we must act now, together." For a moment, there was silence. Then a lone voice called out from the crowd, followed by another. "They're right. The elders have been feeding us lies. Why should we let them take more of our children?" The tension snapped like a bowstring as the villagers surged forward, turning on the guards who had long oppressed them. The square erupted into chaos. Guards who had once terrorized the villagers now found themselves overpowered by the sheer force of the crowd's fury. The battle erupts. Elder Django's eyes widened as he watched his iron grip on the village slip away. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You fools. If you stop the ritual, the spirits will destroy us all." But the villagers were no longer listening. Cato, Nika, and Amina pushed through the throng, making their way toward the platform where the elders stood. Bwana and the remaining guards tried to block their path, but the villagers, fueled by years of anger and betrayal, fought back with a ferocity born of desperation. Kato and Nika fought side by side, their hearts pounding in unison as they pushed through the chaos. The air was filled with the clatter of weapons, the shouts of villagers, and the cries of the wounded. Amina led a group of villagers, wielding her torch like a weapon, driving back the guards who tried to stop them. As they reached the platform, Kato saw Elder Django clutching a dagger, his eyes wild. "You won't stop me," Django snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "I've sacrificed too much to let it end like this." Before Kato could react, Django lunged at him, the dagger aimed straight for his heart. But Nika threw himself in front of Kato, taking the blow meant for him. The crowd gasped as Nika fell to the ground, clutching his side. "Nika!" Kato screamed, dropping to his knees beside him. Blood stained Nika's shirt, and his breathing was shallow. "No, no, no. Stay with me." A desperate stand. The sight of Nika bleeding on the ground sent a shockwave through the crowd. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The villagers, the guards, even the elders paused in stunned silence. Then, with a roar of rage, Amina charged forward, swinging her torch at Django. "You won't take any more lives," she shouted, knocking the dagger from his hand. Kato tore his gaze from Nika's face, his hands trembling as he reached for the scroll in his satchel. "Everyone, listen," he cried, his voice raw. "This is the final proof. The blood moon doesn't demand our lives, the elders do." The villagers, now fully enraged, surged forward, surrounding the platform. Elder Django, realizing he had lost, tried to flee, but the villagers grabbed him, dragging him down into the angry crowd. Kato turned back to Nika, tears streaming down his face. "Stay with me, please," he whispered, pressing his hands against the wound to stop the bleeding. "We're almost free." Nika managed a weak smile, his eyes filled with pain but also love. "For you, Kato. I would fight 1,000 battles." Amina knelt beside them, tears glistening in her eyes. "We did it, Kato. The villagers are with us. The elders' rule is over." A fragile victory. As the first light of dawn began to break through the night sky, the village square was filled with exhausted but victorious villagers. The elders had been overthrown, and the remaining guards had either fled or surrendered. Kato and Amina managed to get Nika to the healer's hut, where Kato worked frantically to save him. Nika's breath came in shallow gasps, but as Kato applied healing herbs to the wound, a faint glimmer of hope sparked in his chest. "You're going to be okay," Kato whispered, his voice breaking. "I won't lose you now." Outside, the villagers began to chant Kato's name, their newfound freedom echoing through the air. But for Kato, all that mattered was the life slipping away in his arms. "Stay with me, Nika," he whispered again, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "We're finally free. Don't leave me now." Nika's eyes fluttered, and a weak smile touched his lips. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. "Not without you." The rising sun cast a soft glow over Lumina Village, its golden light in stark contrast to the blood-soaked chaos of the previous night. The square, now littered with discarded weapons and remnants of the battle, had fallen into an uneasy silence. The villagers, victorious but weary, gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. The elders had been defeated, but a heavy sense of uncertainty hung in the air. Inside the healer's hut, Kato knelt beside Nika, who lay on a straw mat, his face ashen and eyes barely open. Kato's hands trembled as he applied another poultice to Nika's wound, trying to stanch the bleeding that refused to stop. The wound from Elder Django's dagger had been deep, and Kato could feel Nika's life slipping away with each passing moment. "Hold on, Nika," Kato whispered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." Nika managed a faint smile, his fingers twitching against Kato's hand. I'm trying," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But it's so cold." Kato's heart clenched. He couldn't lose Nika, not now, not after everything they had been through. He pressed a desperate kiss to Nika's forehead, his tears falling onto Nika's pale skin. "Stay with me," Kato begged. "I won't let you go." Amina, who had been standing watch at the door, turned to Kato, her eyes filled with sympathy. "The villagers are waiting," she said softly. "They need to see you. They need to know what to do next." Kato's jaw clenched. He didn't want to leave Nika's side, but he knew Amina was right. The village was in turmoil, and they needed a leader to guide them through the chaos that remained. But as he stood to leave, Nika's hand tightened weakly around his wrist. "Go," Nika whispered, his eyes glistening. "I'll be here. Just come back to me." Kato nodded, his heart breaking, and with one last look at Nika, he turned to follow Amina out into the square. The ceremony continues. Outside, the villagers had gathered once more in the square, their faces a mix of fear, confusion, and anger. The red glow of the blood moon still lingered in the sky, casting an eerie light over the village. Although the elders had been overthrown, their threats of impending doom had left the villagers anxious and uncertain. Kato stepped up onto the platform where Elder Django had once stood, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. The villagers fell silent, their eyes turning to him with a mixture of hope and desperation. "My friends," Kato began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The elders are gone, and their reign of terror is over. But we still have one last task to complete. The blood moon's power is waning, but it hasn't disappeared. We must finish the ritual on our own terms." The crowd murmured, uncertain. "What do you mean?" An older villager called out. "The elders said the ceremony was to protect us. If we stop it, will the spirits destroy the village?" Kato held up the ancient scroll he had taken from the elders' chamber. "The ritual they were performing wasn't to protect us, it was to strengthen their own dark magic. But the blood moon itself is not evil. If we perform the true ceremony, we can break the curse that has plagued Lumina Village for generations." Amina stepped forward, raising her voice. "We've all suffered because of the elders' lies," she declared. "But we have the chance to free ourselves once and for all. Will you stand with us?" The villagers exchanged glances, hesitant but hopeful. Finally, one by one, they nodded in agreement. The fear that had kept them in chains for so long was slowly being replaced by a spark of determination. The true ritual. As the villagers prepared for the ceremony, Kato hurried back to the healer's hut to check on Nika. The air inside was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke, but Nika's condition had not improved. His breathing was shallow, and his skin had turned a sickly pale. Kato's heart sank. He knew they were running out of time. The ritual he was about to perform was their only chance, not just to save the village, but to save Nika's life. According to the scroll, the true ceremony required a willing sacrifice, not of blood, but of something far more precious, the essence of a pure heart. "Kato," Nika whispered, his eyes fluttering open. You have to go. Finish the ritual." Kato's eyes filled with tears. "I won't leave you," he said fiercely. "Not like this." Nika's hand trembled as it reached for Kato's cheek. "You have to," he insisted, his voice barely more than a breath. "Save the village. Save yourself." With a heavy heart, Kato pressed a final kiss to Nika's forehead. "I'll come back for you," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The final sacrifice. Returning to the square, Kato found the villagers gathered around the altar, their eyes filled with both hope and fear. Amina stood at the front, guiding them through the steps of the ritual as detailed in the scroll. The crimson light of the blood moon bathed them all in its glow, lending the scene an otherworldly beauty. Kato took his place at the center of the circle, the villagers watching in hushed silence. According to the ancient text, the true ritual required an offering of pure intent, a sacrifice of one's deepest wish for the good of others. Kato knew what he had to do. Closing his eyes, he reached deep within himself, focusing on the one thing that mattered most to him, Nika's life. "I offer my heart's wish," Kato whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I give up the love I hold dearest, so that Lumina Village may be free." A soft glow began to emanate from the altar, and the villagers gasped as the red light of the blood moon intensified. The air seemed to shimmer with energy, and for a moment, it felt as if the very ground beneath them was alive with power. The glow enveloped Kato, warmth flooding through him. He could feel his love for Nika, a love that had kept him going through the darkest of times, being drawn into the ritual. It was agonizing, like ripping out a part of his soul, but he did not stop. If it meant saving Nika, if it meant freeing his people, he would give everything. A miracle unfolds. As the final words of the ritual left Kato's lips, the glow erupted into a brilliant flash of light, blinding everyone in the square. The air was filled with a sound like 1,000 whispers, a sigh of relief from the spirits themselves. When the light faded, the villagers found themselves bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun. The red light of the blood moon had vanished, and with it, the curse that had plagued the village for generations. Kato swayed on his feet, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Amina caught him just before he fell, her eyes wide with awe. "You did it, Kato," she whispered. "You saved us." But Kato's mind was only on one thing. "Nika," he gasped, struggling to stand. "I have to see him." Together, they rushed back to the healer's hut. As they entered, Kato's heart leaped. Nika was sitting up, color slowly returning to his cheeks. "Kato," Nika whispered, his eyes filled with tears. You came back." Kato dropped to his knees beside him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I promised," he said, his voice breaking. "And I always keep my promises." The villagers cheered as word spread that the curse had been lifted and Nika had been saved. For the first time in years, Lumina village was free. The reign of the elders was over, and a new dawn had begun. The sun was rising, its warm light spilling over Lumina village like a golden promise of a new beginning. The villagers, still dazed from the events of the previous night, began to gather once more in the square. There was no longer the heavy atmosphere of fear and dread that had lingered under the elders' rule. Instead, there was an air of cautious hope. Inside the healer's hut, Nika sat propped up against a stack of blankets. Though still weak, his breathing was steady, and color had returned to his cheeks. Kato hovered by his side, his eyes red from exhaustion and relief. He hadn't left Nika's side since the ritual had ended. "I thought I'd lost you," Kato whispered, his voice raw with emotion. He reached out, brushing a lock of hair from Nika's forehead. Nika gave him a small, tired smile. "You didn't get rid of me that easily," he murmured. But beneath his attempt at humor, there was a shadow of something deeper, an understanding that they had narrowly escaped death. Amina entered the hut, her face alight with excitement. "Kato, the villagers are gathering," she said. "They're asking for you. They want to know what happens next." Kato's heart sank. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but he knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The elders had been defeated, but Lumina village was still fragile, like a bird with broken wings learning to fly again. Kato looked at Nika, who nodded, encouraging him. "Go," Nika urged. "I'll be here when you're done." Taking a deep breath, Kato stood, squeezing Nika's hand one last time before following Amina out into the square. The villagers' decision. As Kato stepped onto the platform where Elder Django had once stood, a hush fell over the crowd. Hundreds of eyes turned to him, filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. For so long, the villagers had lived under the elders' iron rule. Now, for the first time in years, they were free, but that freedom came with its own challenges. Kato took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "We have won a great victory," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But our work is not finished. The elders may be gone, but their shadows still linger in our hearts and minds. We must learn to live without fear, to trust each other again." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Villagers who had once been divided by suspicion now stood side by side, united by their shared struggle. A voice called out from the crowd, a young woman with tears in her eyes. "What will we do now? How can we rebuild after everything that's happened?" Kato paused, searching for the right words. "We rebuild by choosing hope over fear, by helping each other heal," he said. The power of the blood moon was never in the sacrifices or rituals. It was always in our hearts, in our willingness to fight for each other. Amina stepped forward, adding her voice to Kato's. We have been through so much, but now we have a chance to make our village something greater than it ever was. Let's use this moment to change Lumina Village, to build a community where no one has to live in fear again. The villagers erupted into cheers, their voices filling the square. For the first time in years, they were united in hope rather than fear. Kato felt a warmth spread through his chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing anxiety. There was one final task he had to complete before they could truly be free. The final confrontation. Kato turned to Amina. We still have one last thing to do, he said. Elder Django and Bwana are still out there. If we don't deal with them, they could try to reclaim their power. Amina nodded. We've captured some of the guards, but Django and Bwana managed to escape during the chaos last night. They won't go down without a fight. Kato's eyes hardened. Then we find them and end this once and for all. Leaving the villagers to celebrate their newfound freedom, Kato, Nika, and Amina gathered a small group of trusted villagers. Armed with makeshift weapons, they set off toward the dense forest on the outskirts of the village. According to the villagers who had seen them flee, Django and Bwana had taken refuge in an old, abandoned shrine deep in the woods. As they approached the shrine, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. Kato's grip tightened on his staff, his senses on high alert. He could feel the remnants of dark magic lingering in the air, Django's final attempt to hold onto his crumbling power. Nika, though still weak, walked beside Kato, refusing to be left behind. I'm not letting you face them alone, Nika said, his voice resolute. Kato's heart swelled with love and pride. Together, then, he said softly, squeezing Nika's hand. A battle for freedom. As they reached the shrine, they saw Django and Bwana standing at the altar, their backs turned. The sight of them, two men who had once commanded the respect and fear of the entire village, now reduced to desperate fugitives, was almost pitiable. Stop right there, Django, Kato called out, his voice ringing through the silent forest. It's over. The villagers know the truth. Your power is gone. Django turned slowly, his eyes burning with hatred. You think you've won? He snarled. You think these weak villagers can survive without the guidance of the elders? You're fools. Without us, Lumina Village will fall into chaos. Kato took a step forward, his voice steady. You've used fear to control us for too long. The villagers don't need your lies anymore. But before Kato could say more, Bwana lunged at him, a knife gleaming in his hand. Nika reacted instantly, throwing himself between Kato and the blade. There was a flash of steel, and Nika cried out, collapsing to the ground. Nika! Kato screamed, dropping to his knees beside him. Blood pooled beneath Nika's body, but his eyes were filled with determination. Kato, finish this, Nika gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Kato's vision blurred with tears, but he forced himself to stand. You won't hurt anyone else, he said, his voice filled with a cold fury. Summoning the last of his strength, Kato unleashed a burst of energy, knocking Bwana to the ground. Django's eyes widened in fear as Kato turned to face him. You can't stop me, Django hissed, clutching a vial of dark liquid. I will rise again. But before he could drink the potion, Amina struck his hand with a well-aimed blow, shattering the vial. The dark liquid spilled onto the ground, hissing as it evaporated. It's over, Amina said coldly, her eyes locked on Django. You've lost. A bitter victory. As the last remnants of Django's magic faded, Kato rushed back to Nika's side. Amina and the villagers surrounded them, their faces a mix of relief and sorrow. Nika's breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering as he fought to stay conscious. Kato. Nika whispered, his voice fading. Did we win? Kato nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, we did, he said, cradling Nika's head in his lap. We're free, Nika. You saved us. A faint smile touched Nika's lips before his eyes closed. Kato's heart ached, but he refused to let despair take him. He had one last chance to save the man he loved. Gathering his strength, Kato began to channel the healing energy he had used so many times before. "Stay with me," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "You can't leave me now." As Kato poured his heart into the healing, a soft glow enveloped Nika. The villagers watched in awe as the power of the blood moon, now freed from the elder's corruption, flowed through Kato's hands. Slowly, Nika's breathing steadied, and color returned to his cheeks. His eyes fluttered open, and he smiled weakly up at Kato. "I told you. I wasn't leaving," he whispered. Kato laughed through his tears, pulling Nika into a tight embrace. Around them, the villagers cheered, the sound echoing through the forest as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The golden light of dawn bathed Lumina Village in a soft, warm glow as the first rays of the sun crept over the treetops. The villagers, weary but triumphant, gathered in the square one last time. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, tears of relief, and the murmurs of people embracing a future that only hours ago had seemed impossible. At the center of the square, Kato stood with Nika by his side. Nika's arm was wrapped in a bandage, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered to Kato. As they looked out over the crowd, Kato's heart swelled with gratitude. They had survived the darkness, and now a new chapter was about to begin. Amina approached them, her eyes shining with pride. "The people are waiting for you, Kato," she said softly, nodding toward the villagers who had gathered expectantly. Kato swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped forward, raising his hands to silence the crowd. The square fell quiet, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. "The village unites. My friends," Kato began, his voice carrying across the square, "we have all been through so much. We've lost loved ones, endured fear, and faced unimaginable horrors. But today we stand here free." A cheer erupted from the crowd, but Kato held up his hand, signaling for silence. The blood moon was not a curse upon us. The real curse was the fear the elders used to control us. We have broken their hold, but now we must learn to live without that fear. Kato paused, searching the faces of the villagers. He saw the same mix of relief, hope, and uncertainty that he felt in his own heart. We must rebuild Lumina Village, not just with our hands, but with our hearts. We must learn to trust each other again, to help those who have suffered, and to create a home where no one is afraid to be themselves. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The villagers nodded, some with tears streaming down their faces. They had been broken, but now they had the chance to heal. Amina stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "We have been given a second chance," she said. "Let us use it wisely. Let us create a village where everyone is welcome, where no one is judged or cast aside." The villagers cheered again, louder this time. Kato looked at Nika, who squeezed his hand, a silent promise passing between them. They had fought hard for this moment, and they were going to make the most of it. A moment of peace. As the villagers dispersed to begin cleaning up the square and tending to the wounded, Kato and Nika slipped away, seeking a moment of quiet amid the chaos. They found themselves by the river, where they had shared so many secret meetings. The water sparkled in the morning light, reflecting the vibrant colors of the new day. Kato leaned against a tree, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. "We did it," he murmured, looking over at Nika with a tired smile. "We're really free." Nika chuckled softly, though there was a shadow in his eyes. "We're free, yes," he said. "But what now, Kato? The village needs a leader. They're looking to you." Kato shook his head. "I'm just a healer," he said, though he could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "I never wanted to lead anyone. I just wanted to protect the people I cared about." Nika took Kato's hand, lacing their fingers together. "You don't have to do it alone," he said quietly. "We can rebuild this village together. You've given them hope, Kato. Now it's time to help them build something new." Kato looked into Nika's eyes and saw the future they could have together, a future where they no longer had to hide, where they could live openly, surrounded by the people they had fought so hard to protect. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kato allowed himself to hope. A new beginning. Later that afternoon, the villagers gathered one last time in the square for a final celebration. The air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meat, and the sound of laughter echoed through the village. For the first time in years, Lumina Village was filled with joy. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Kato stood once again before the villagers. This time, he did not stand alone. Amina stood at his side, along with Nika, who was still recovering but determined to show his strength. "My friends," Kato said, his voice strong and clear, "we have taken the first steps toward a new future. But our journey is just beginning. We must be the ones to decide what kind of village we want to build. One where everyone has a voice, where no one lives in fear." Amina raised her hand, holding up a piece of parchment. "We will draft new laws that protect the weak, that encourage kindness, and that ensure no one is ever sacrificed for the whims of the powerful." The villagers erupted in cheers once more, their voices filled with hope and determination. Kato smiled, turning to Nika, who was beaming with pride. "We did this," Nika whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You gave them a reason to believe again." "No," Kato said, shaking his head. "We did this together. And we'll keep doing it as long as it takes." A final plot twist. As the celebrations continued, Amina approached Kato with a hesitant smile. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "While cleaning out the elders' chambers, we found another set of scrolls. They contained information about a hidden treasure buried beneath the village, a source of power that the elders had been protecting for centuries." Kato's eyes widened. "A hidden treasure? What kind of power?" Amina nodded. "We haven't opened it yet, but it's said to contain a source of magic that could either protect or destroy the village. It's up to us to decide how to use it." Nika's eyes gleamed with excitement, but Kato felt a chill run down his spine. They had just freed the village from the grip of dark magic. What would happen if that power fell into the wrong hands again? "We'll deal with it together," Kato said firmly. "Whatever it is, we won't let it corrupt us like it did the elders." The villagers, now united in both purpose and spirit, had a new challenge ahead of them. But for the first time in years, they faced the future with hope instead of fear. Epilogue: A New Legacy. In the days that followed, Kato, Nika, and Amina worked tirelessly with the villagers to rebuild Lumina Village. The scars of the past would take time to heal, but there was a newfound spirit of resilience in the air. Kato and Nika walked hand in hand through the village they had saved, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. As they watched the children play and the villagers laugh, they knew they had truly won. No longer bound by the shadows of fear and secrecy, they were finally free to live the lives they had always dreamed of. And together, they would ensure that Lumina Village would never again be ruled by darkness. The blood-red moon had set, and in its place, a new dawn had risen, a dawn filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.